Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Well, welcome back to the program, Chester. So glad you're joining us again on the Good Leadership Podcast.
Yeah, no, great to be here. I had so much fun the first time. Hey, why not do it again?
There you go. And today I wanted really to make the topic of this episode anxiety at work, because anxiety has seen huge spikes from the pandemic, more uncertainty, more challenging times, and people are looking for ways to get around it, to deal with it more effectively. And I loved your book. But before we get into your book, tell us a little bit about your background, just to remind our listeners from last time, what got you interested in this topic?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Adrian Gostick is my co-author and probably my best friend in the world at this point. We've been writing about culture and leadership and all that good stuff for over 20 years. And it was really interesting. We released our book, Leading with Gratitude, right before the pandemic. In fact, like literally 2 weeks before the pandemic. If you want a tip on when not to release a book, 2 weeks before the pandemic should be on that list if you know they're coming. And it was so interesting. The book did very, very well, and I highly recommend it. By the way, if you ask Adrian and I what's our favorite book, and we've written 14 books together now, universally we say, oh, it's Leading with Gratitude. If you ask what's our most important book that we've written, it's by far Anxiety at Work. And the story behind that is kind of fun because, if you look at our books, it was always Gostick and Elton. We wanted our brand to be like Lennon and McCartney, right? And that's a pretty high bar. At any rate, this book is written by Gostick and Elton and Gostick. We've got a co-author, Anthony Gostick, which is Adrian's son. Now, I've known Anthony, or Tony, as I like to call him, since he was 6 years old. And he's always been an anxious kid. And he's the classic, millennial. He's super smart, digital age kid. And yet, just anxious about stuff. I mean, think about it. This is the generation that walks into a theater and looks, what's the fastest way out of here? And they've got active shooter drills and on and on and on, right? Stuff that I never went through as a kid. And he challenged us. He said, you guys talk about culture and leadership. Do you ever think about writing about, mental health and anxiety? Well, Adrian and I are the tail end of the baby boomers. We looked at him and said, yeah, no, we're not. We're not writing about that. You don't get it. Our generation, if you talked about mental health, that was the ultimate sign of weakness. I mean, when I played sports, if somebody got knocked out, we all laughed. We gave them some smelling salts and sent them back in, I still think that's kind of funny, by the way, although I know I shouldn't. The point is that our generation was, hey, cheer up, rub some dirt on it, get back in the game. And Anthony said something to us that really stuck. He said, you oldies, I appreciated the moniker, you oldies never talk about this. He said, my generation, it's all we talk about. He said, we start every conversation with, how are you doing? And what we mean by that is, how are you doing mentally? How are you handling your anxiety, your depression, and so on? He says, you're missing the boat if you don't take a look at this. And we did. And the numbers were scary. But what was really encouraging is, so were the strategies that you'd use to manage anxiety. And that's what led to us writing Anxiety at Work.
Thank you for providing that insight, and that's powerful. I knew that backstory, but it's great to have our listeners hear it as well. Love for us to kind of go in and distinguish anxiety between worry and stress, because I think many people feel like, okay, they're all one and the same, and if I'm worrying, then I'm probably going to be stressful and it's going to cause anxiety. But if you could just differentiate those terms so we have a better understanding of kind of which area is the purview of each one.
Yeah, no, a great distinction and a great way to start the conversation. We talked to a lot of counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists and so on. They said, depression is worrying about the past. Anxiety is worrying about the future. So one of the strategies is just try to stay in the present as much as possible. Now, you bring up the good point about the word stress. Anxiety and stress, same, right? So absolutely not. Stress tends to be more episodic. It's that moment in time. And by the way, a little bit of stress can be good. A little bit of anxiety can be good. You get your adrenaline going, you get up for the presentation, the game, whatever it might be. It's that persistent worry about the future. That's anxiety. And that becomes debilitating. When we looked at our research, what we wanted to look at was the anxiety disorder. In other words, you were so anxious that it prevented you from doing your job. It prevented you from doing your best work. So, stress can be momentary. Now, a lot of leaders, the myth around stress is hold their feet to the fire, put the fear of God in them. That'll make them productive. And that is true, by the way, over a very short period of time. If every day, it's a massive amount of stress, well, that's where you get heart palpitations and all kinds of mental and physical disorders. So the distinction, I think, needs to be very clear. Depression, worrying about the past; anxiety, worrying about the future. Stress is that moment, and hopefully it passes, right? You gear up for it. You've got that 2-week period or even that 2-hour period, and then it subsides and you can recover. And the anxiety that we talk about is that persistent worry.
That's a great distinction to make. Thank you for providing that. I think both of us agree that anxiety has risen. You give a lot of great stats and figures in your book regarding that. And you alluded to this earlier in the conversation, but I would assume that it's impacting generations differently, correct?
And no question about it. When we looked at the data pre-pandemic, about 18% of all workers said that they had some kind of anxiety disorder. So still pretty high. That's like 1 in 5. By the end of 2021, the middle of 2022, that number jumped to 30%. So now you're approaching almost a third. When you broke it out generationally, workers in their 20s, it was at 42%. I mean, you're approaching half your people. And then when you looked at millennials and Gen Z, 50% of millennials and 75% of Gen Z said they had left a job due to mental health. And of course, the question that you want to beg is say, well, why are you leaving? And the answer is fairly obvious, is they're afraid to talk about it. If you admit that you need a mental day off or you're suffering from anxiety, it's immediately perceived is that you're not tough enough. You're not up to it. And, I think we told you this was going to be a high stress job. And rather than admit that, it's easier to quit and go find another job.
Well, and that's what you were mentioning too, with those generational differences, is that in the older generations, you just didn't talk about it. You just bucked up and did it. It wasn't something, it showed vulnerability, it showed weakness, and that's not something you wanted to showcase in a work setting. But I love the term that you came up with, and I think it came out of Stanford, the duck syndrome. If you think of people, and it really relates quite well to anxiety, right?
Yeah. Stanford is obviously ridiculously hard to get into, right? I mean, they get like 300,000 applications. They take like 200 or something like that. I always joke, I've actually had a chance to lecture at Stanford. It's the only way I was going to get in. There's no way my grades were going to get me there. And of course, everybody's amazing. They all speak 5 languages and they're fit, and they don't just, play on the basketball team. They're on the debate team and the fencing team. On and on and on. So they started to call each other out because, nobody's that perfect, nobody. And they said, look, you're not fooling anybody. You're a duck. You're gliding across the pond and it looks like you've got everything in order, but we know that underneath there, you're paddling like mad. And one of them actually pointed out to us that the mother duck and the baby ducks, the baby ducks are looking at the other baby ducks and going, hey, they look like they're doing pretty well. I better paddle faster to keep up, So this idea of hiding it because it's below the surface. And, we've seen a lot of this in the recent past. Students that are under so much pressure and so much stress, self-harm and suicide rates are up. And why? Because we haven't made it safe to talk about. And that's, one of the strategies that we really encourage leaders is, how do you create a culture where it's safe to talk about this? Because if you put it in practical terms, like, look, if all of a sudden 42% of my workers in their 20s showed up with a broken leg, we'd be all over that. We'd say, are you kidding? I would joke that if they're in their 20s, you should probably just take their skateboards away from them. That would fix half of them, right? The point is something physical happens. We go, oh, take all the time you need, go to physical therapy and take your time and come back when you're ready. When it's mental health, we've still got that stigma. For those of you that are leaders listening to this, one of the best ways to make it safe to talk about is, if you feel comfortable, is showing a little bit of vulnerability and tell your story. When you felt particularly stressed and the impact it had on you, and the fact that when you talked about it with your coworkers and your leader, it got better. It didn't get worse. Once the leader, and we have a great story of Nabila X-Taliban. She's the chief people officer for Walmart Canada, 100,000 employees. She talks about her anxiety all the time. And well, if she can talk about it, then it's safe for us to talk about it. And you lower those anxiety levels, you make it safe. And you want to talk about a great retention strategy. You know, that 50% of millennials and 75% of Gen Z are less likely to quit and leave because now they've got a safe place to talk about it. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Having that psychological safety by showing vulnerability by the leader is so important if you want this conversation to start happening, and to look at anxiety as where many people may look fine on the surface, but really in reality, they're not. And you don't know what is going through their mind. I love the quote that you made. I'm not sure if it was, like I said, in a podcast or a book, but one of your favorite quotes by your dad, and showing people more gratitude and just not realizing what they're going through each day. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, well, my dad was very quotable, so I hope I get the right one. But it's a really fun story at the end. My dad just assumed that he was just a joyful guy. He's just a happy guy. And so he said, just assume that everything anybody says to you is a compliment. So we were at church one day. Is this the story you want about the old lady that came up?
That's a good one too. The quote that you had stated in one was, be good to everyone, but everyone is having a tough day,
Oh, yeah.
and you just don't know, what kind of day they're having. So, just assume positive intent and be good to everyone, because
Well,
everyone's
and
having a tough day.
yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. Like I said, my dad's very quotable. It could have been one of 100.
I love all you. I'd be happy for you to share the other story as well, because I'm sure it's going to resonate
Yeah.
with listeners as well.
But the point that dad made, and one of the things I loved about my dad is he treated everybody with respect. Whether you were parking his car, bagging his groceries, or you were a captain of industry, he was kind. And that was his mantra. He goes, look, everybody's having a tough day, Jess. I remember as a kid, we were driving to go do something, and I grew up in British Columbia, and we were in traffic, and this guy drove by in an Aston Martin car. Now, if you grew up, in British Columbia, or you have English, Aston Martin, this is the coolest cars ever. And I said to my dad, I said, wow, what would it be like to be that guy and own that car? And he looked at me and he kind of giggled and he said, Jess, you never want to trade places with anybody. He says, you have no idea what that guy's troubles are. Be happy that you've got your own worries. Literally, everybody's got something. You don't want to get a car? I don't think that's a good trade. And that's what I loved about him. The homeless people, he was just kind, and he would listen. And my dad was one of those guys where when you spent time with him, you always came away feeling better about yourself, not just about him, but you felt better about yourself. It was a wonderful gift.
Really caring for your employees and really wanting to know what's going on with them, caring not only for their physical, but mental issues as well, and really unpacking that. And a lot of society right now, one of the big buzzwords is resilience. They want
Right.
leaders that are more resilient. And you mentioned two things in your book that really allow people to recover faster, to build that resilient muscle. One is mastery and the other is social support. How important do those continue to be to build that within the individual?
Mastery is one of those things, it gives you a lot of confidence. When you practice and you take pride in your work, repetition and practice, that mastery gives you a lot of confidence. The social network, I think, is more important than ever. So often when we hit hard times, particularly psychologically, our mental health, our first reaction is A, never to admit it, and two, to pull back. We go off by ourselves. It always reminds me of those signs in the restaurant. If you're choking, don't go off by yourself. It's really hard to give yourself the Heimlich, right? Be in a group. Go to people that love and support you. Have a support network. I had a great experience with this not too long ago. I was getting ready to do this virtual presentation. Now, we do lots of virtual presentations, and I like to think we're really good at it, right? For whatever reason, this one I was really anxious. I didn't sleep well the night before. I'd got everything all set up, And what I did was about 2 hours before the presentation, I texted like 15 of my good friends. And I said, hey, the Apostle of Appreciation is really anxious about this presentation I'm about to make. Can you just text me something to make me feel good about myself? And it's a silly thing, right? They came pouring in. It was so great. In fact, one of my friends called me later and said, hey, I just want to make sure you're okay. Because, you never ask for help. And then he said, by the way, What a great example. He says, as leaders, we always think, I can never have a bad day. I've got to be the giver. I can never be the receiver. Well, when you ask people for help, it means the world to them. I had a leader who said, look, I'm so blessed, I don't need anything. And I said to her, I said, well, when people ask you for help, do you give it to them? She goes, every time. I go, how does it make you feel? She goes, it makes me feel great. I said, why would you deny somebody that same feeling to feel great about serving you? And they went, he was like, brother, when you put it like that. So this idea of having a supportive community, whether it's a mentor or a network. One quick story that I love to share about having a support network. These guys did a study of firehouses. And what were the best firehouses that had the best response time, the best survival rates, and all that good stuff? When they came into the firehouse, the first thing they looked for, or one of the first things, is do they eat together? Isn't that interesting? Because when they ate together, that was a sign that they liked each other. And I am a big believer. I grew up in a very spiritual family, that eating together, it's kind of a sacred moment. You're taking care of each other, you're feeding each other. They said when we went into firehouses and they grabbed their lunches and they went off to the various corners, we knew there was trouble. We knew there was trouble. So, in building your network, who are you having breakfast with? Who are you having lunch with? Who are you going out for drinks with? Who are you, are you bringing in coffee and donuts? Or are you just kind of sitting around and just getting to know each other? Build a social network, because I guarantee you, we're all this way. There's going to come that moment when you're going to say, I'm overwhelmed. I need help. Who do you call?
And then it could be too late, right? And I know this from my experience is that it gets lonelier and lonelier as you go higher in the organization. And I love how you stated that. And I'm going to take that to heart to think, why would I deny someone the gift of trying to support and help me as well? If I have such joy in that, why would I not think that they would have joy in reciprocating that, right? Because it's only natural to assume, but as you go higher in any organization, many leaders feel like they can't ask those questions. It's a sign of weakness if they ask for support or acknowledgement, or they feel like they're too needy. Then they just need to be secure in what they're doing and know they're moving confidently in the right direction, which is not the right approach to take.
Yeah, and I think the best example of all the leaders I've ever known, and he's become a dear friend of mine, is Gary Ridge. He just retired at WD-40. He said the 3 most powerful words that any great leader can say in a meeting is, I don't know. I don't know. Let's figure it out. He said, I'm just smart enough to know that I'm consciously incompetent. Which was, he's got a great sense of humor. I'll tell you, you make a really good point, is that the higher up you get, the lonelier it is. That's why I think organizations like YPO and EO are really important, that you have a network of other leaders that you can talk to. One of my favorite things to do when we do our training or speak at a conference, when we talk about anxiety, is I'll say, hey, how many of you have somebody on your team that just kills it every time? Like you're just your superstar. They all raise their hands. I go, and what do we do with those superstars? The guy says, load them up. I go, that's right. It's not the 80-20 rule. It's the 90-10 rule. You've got this one person on your team and she just kills it every day. I guarantee you they're the most anxious, because they've got this reputation that they never let you down. Their work is always excellent. And those are the people that you need to really engage with the most and let them know it's okay to cry uncle. It's okay to ask for help. And that's one of the strategies in our book is we say, look, are you distributing the work? Are you rotating it around? Are you talking about? And you talked about psychological safety a little earlier. Is it okay to fail? One of the things at WD-40 is WD-40 stands for Water Displacement 40th Formula. It took them 39 tries before they hit the 40th one. And he goes, we don't make mistakes at WD-40. We have learning moments. And boy, when you can create not just psychological safety, but emotional safety, that, hey, I've made a mistake. And the first question is, okay, how do we solve the problem? And what have we learned? Oh, anxiety levels go way down. And innovation goes up, productivity goes up, loyalty goes up. You can go on and on. Isn't that wonderful?
That is wonderful. Learning moments. Love that. Also love the fact that it's empathy and care. And that's really what leaders really need to start leading with more than some of those other qualities. You have 8 strategies or 8 sources of anxiety in your book. We're not going to be able to unpack them all, but I'd just like to touch on one before we close today. And that's really the first one. Employees dealing with uncertainty about the organization's strategy for contending with challenges and how it affects job security. And we're living in very challenging times, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty. Many leaders can't really tell them the full story, or they don't know the full story. But what are some of the ways that leaders can really impart upon their employees things that will make them feel less insecure when they're talking about the continual ambiguity in the company? Because what you state in your book, which I completely agree with, most people do their best work in structured environments. They do not do their work or thrive in uncertain times where they don't know where they are, where they don't know if they're making a meaningful impact, if their team is moving in the right direction. And I think that's a myth that really needs to be dispelled in those companies that feel like, yes, this is the way we need to move moving forward.
Yeah, a friend of ours, Darcy Verhoeven, wrote a wonderful book. I love the title. It's called The Freedom of Constraint. This is kind of once I know what the rules are, I can do it. I'm free to do a lot of things, right? And this idea of leaders that, look, you can't over communicate, particularly in a crisis. If you think you're over communicating, you're probably about right. Whether it's your newsletters or your town hall meetings or your check-ins or your one-on-ones. I mean, employees want the answers to basically 4 questions, and they want them on a regular basis. One is, how's the company doing? So you communicate, hey, we're doing great. Or, hey, this is going to be a tough quarter. We knew it would be because of supply chain, whatever, right? How's the company doing? Where are we going as a company, right? Are we going to be opening new markets? Do we have new products? What's in the pipeline? Are we merging? All that kind of stuff. So once I feel good about that, and by the way, good or ill, at least I know, right? There's no hidden agendas. And then the next 2 questions are about the employee. How am I doing? And on a regular basis, right? Not just at the year-end evaluation, it's the regular check-ins. And then the last one is, do I have a future here? In other words, where are my places to grow? And growth doesn't always mean a raise and a promotion. Growth is a new project, a new skill set, or whatever. So if I know how the company's doing, where we're going, how I'm doing, and have a future here, boy, anxiety levels come way down because uncertainty has come way down. You've answered the most important questions that I wake up every morning thinking, are we going to go out of business? Do I have a job? Can I pay my bill? You start that rapid breathing, and that's not productive for anybody. So if you can remember those 4 things, and then one overarching idea that when you think you're over communicating, it's probably about right, I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you. And those first 2 are organizational level. The second 2 are more individual level. What if that person's not performing well? What are a couple tips that you can help our listeners with constructive feedback? Because that's so difficult for new managers, for seasoned managers to provide that type of constructive feedback to really get them to grow and develop in their roles.
An excellent point. We came across a wonderful study that Forbes magazine did. Said 9 out of 10 managers don't like to give feedback to employees because they think it'll be perceived as negative. And yet 2/3 of employees say, I don't get enough feedback, right? What I think happens in a lot of these situations, because leaders are afraid to have those conversations, is a lot of employees don't know that they're not doing well because you haven't told them. So this idea of regular check-ins, I think, is really important. And that accountability piece, that freedom of constraint. Look, these are the numbers we have to hit. Here's the time we have to do it. I'm checking in with you on a regular basis. How are we doing? Do you need more resources? What are we learning? How can we? And then it's pretty obvious. Alan Mulally, one of the great leaders who saved the Ford Motor Company, he said, Jess, I've never fired anybody. I said, I find that hard to believe. He said, no, we're very much an accountable company. We have our matrix. We hold each other accountable. And here's how we do it, right? Here's the way we do it, the way we treat each other, our culture. And he says, I would call people in and I'd say, hey, look, Charles, your numbers aren't where they need to be. Now, here's where they need to be. And here's how we want to do it. Now, if you can't get there, if you can't do it the Ford way or the Alan Mulally way, just let me know. I'll still love you. You can't work here, right? That'll be obvious. I'll wish you well. It doesn't always work out, and that's okay. Like, if you can't do it, that's okay. Just let me know. And what a wonderful way to say, look, maybe you're just in the wrong job, or you haven't got the right skill set, or there's just not a fit here, and that's okay. Ford isn't the place for everybody, right? American Express isn't for everybody. For the people it is for, they can thrive. So if you've got those regular check-ins, it's not going to be a surprise that I'm underperforming. I know I'm underperforming. You know I'm underperforming. Now we just got to figure out, can we fix it? If we can, great. And if we can't, that's okay too. I wish you well. I love that.
Wonderful advice and a great story. Thank you, Chester, for joining me again on the podcast. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Yeah, thecultureworks.com is a great place to find all the good stuff we do. LinkedIn, we have a wonderful newsletter every 2 weeks called the Gratitude Journal. The 8th strategy on dealing with anxiety is gratitude. And we have a wonderful podcast called Anxiety at Work, where we host a lot of business leaders. We bring in a lot of thought leaders and counselors, some really great tips in there. We really love that podcast as well. So LinkedIn, thecultureworks.com, and Anxiety at Work. And of course, our book is available at fine bookstores and online, anywhere you can find them. Anxiety at Work and Leading with Gratitude.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into this topic and all the tips and tools that were shared. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. As always, you can head over to my LinkedIn page where you can see all the latest articles and posts from me. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. I look forward to serving you in the next episode, so hit subscribe and I'll see you then. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.